Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Breaking History. Today is November 27th, the day before Thanksgiving. Matt, unfortunately, is tied up, so he couldn't be with us today. But luckily, I was able to get a great stand-in for him with Colonel Towner Watkins. Colonel, welcome. It's so great to have you back. How have you been?
I'm great, and it's great to be here. Love being on your show.
Awesome. Well, today we are going to be discussing a topic that I've been wanting to cover for a while. And I knew you'd be the perfect person to do it with, and that would be Syria. It certainly is back in the news, and it seems like the conflict in the Middle East is shifting. It shifted from Gaza and Hamas to Lebanon and Hezbollah, and now it's shifting to Syria. So I think it's a very timely moment to kind of have this conversation, and it might be a multi-episode discussion because there's a lot to cover. So with that said, before we jump into it, let's run a quick ad, and then we can kind of get into the meat of it all. All right. The last 4 years have put so much stress on American family finances. Help end the stress now with President-elect Donald Trump and by investing in gold and silver. Join the thousands of hardworking Americans taking proactive steps to help protect and safeguard their savings with our partners at Goldco. Goldco has been established as a top-rated precious metals company and a leader in the gold industry, providing white glove treatment for over 10 years. Their buyback guarantee assures you that if your situation changes, they will repurchase your metals at the best price, providing you with peace of mind. You'll have the peace of mind that comes from knowing that your hard-earned assets are securely diversified. Find out the relationship between gold, silver, Trump, and you with the free report focused on Trump and your financial future. You may even qualify for up to 10% back in bonus silver. Visit badlandsgold.com to claim your free information and instantsilver.com/Badlands to see how much free silver you can get. That's badlandsgold.com and instantsilver.com/Badlands to take control of your financial destiny. All right. And thank you to Goldco for that. And let's get rolling. So I want to share, let's see, I'm trying to think of the best way to do this. So there's this really great video. There's a guy named Kavork. He has a Rumble channel called Syrian Analysis, and basically I've been on his show a few times. Basically his background is he's a Christian from Syria, born and raised in Syria. He's probably around my age, in his 30s, I believe. And in 2012, when the Syrian civil war began, his brother was kidnapped by ISIS. It's unclear to me whether his brother was killed or not. I don't think he was. But in any event, he was kidnapped by ISIS. The family fled Syria. He's been living in Germany ever since. He started a podcast in 2017 and basically does what we do at Badlands from the perspective of a Syrian, like of a displaced Syrian living in Germany, a truth seeker. And so he had this from time to time, I'll check in on his show and watch his show, especially when Syria's in the news. And he had a really great episode the other day where he was talking about the conversation between Tucker Carlson and Glenn Greenwald that Tucker recently did. And in the episode, he played a video that he had made along with one of his producers, where he took an interview of the former Qatari foreign minister, and they put captions on it. So this is an interview that would have played, I guess, in Qatar, maybe in the Middle East. It's in Arabic, and they went ahead and put the captions on there so we as English speakers could understand what he was saying. But basically, this guy is trying to explain to everyone why the Syrian civil war happened, and that the whole thing was really the CIA's and their nexus, their idea, and they brought together all these different groups: Saudi Arabia, Jordan, UAE, Qatar, and ultimately they were like, we need $2 trillion to invest in this effort to overthrow the Syrian government. But we'll watch the video. I'm going to skip ahead to a second clip that he plays, and then we can kind of talk about it. But I think it's a fascinating contextualizing of the conversation we're about to have. So with that said, let me know, by the way, Colonel, if the sound is not coming through on your end,
Sure.
please. And I need to make sure I add it to the stage. I always forget to do that.
Site. I will just do this so that you can see the subtitles well. Let's go.
أول ما بدأ الموضوع لسوريا توجهت
And so what I'll do is I will read what the guy's saying as quickly as I can, because I know there are people who are only listening and not watching because it's all in Arabic. So I will read what the captions as he's saying it. So he starts, when the events first started in Syria, I went to Saudi Arabia. This is the foreign minister from Qatar. And I met with King Abdullah, and I did that on the instructions of His Highness the Prince. I'm gonna mute it. The Prince, my father, Abdullah. That's the king of Saudi Arabia, the king before MBS's father became king. This would have been 2011, I think. He said, "We are behind you. You go ahead with this plan, and we will coordinate. But you should be in charge." This is Saudi Arabia telling Qatar they're in charge. I won't get into details, but we took full charge. And anything that was sent to Syria would go to Turkey and was in coordination with U.S. forces. And everything was distributed via the Turks and the U.S. forces. And us and everyone else was involved, the military people. There have been many mistakes, and support was given to the wrong faction. And so what he's saying is that we basically gave a bunch of money to the wrong people. And so what Kevork is saying, and we don't need to listen to his analysis, but what he's saying is that this is a false narrative that basically kind of like a CYA, like cover your ass narrative saying, hey, we didn't know we were funding ISIS, but we were funding ISIS because they gave a bunch of money to ISIS, to these rebel groups to overthrow Assad. And then let's see. Okay, and then there's a little bit of translation here that so Daesh, when I say Daesh, I'm referring to ISIS, and when I say the lady, I'm referring to Bashar al-Assad. That's there's a nickname that they have for him over there. It doesn't translate to the lady, but I think the AI or whatever translates it to the lady, but it's something else. But when I say the lady, I'll just say Assad, but that's what they're referring to. And so he says. He says, but not Daesh. So we gave money to the wrong faction, but not Daesh. They are exaggerating if they say that. Maybe there was a relationship with Nusra. Nusra is ISIS. But it's possible, but I don't myself know that. But I can tell you that even if this was the case, when it was decided that Nusra is not acceptable, that's ISIS, the support for Nusra stopped and the concentration was on the liberation of Syria. We were fighting over Assad, and now Assad is gone, and we are still fighting. And now Assad is still there. If you say, okay, Assad is okay, we don't mind. We have no feelings of vengeance against him, but you were with us in the same trench, talking about the Saudis. You were with us in the same trench. If you change your thinking, we can do that too. The issue here is there is and he pauses. And then he goes on to say the issue is like with communication. And this is a separate interview where you have I think it's a different guy, but this is where this guy really tells some important facts here. So he says from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Jordan, and the United States. This is a different interview. And before that, he says we got $2 trillion. So everything military support was going through this committee. There was a committee that was formed to take out Assad, whether here or there. A security committee, of course. Yes, and that's the interview you're asking for clarification. Yes, a security committee, he responds. Therefore, it came at a stage where Bandar, just to give context, at the time is the national security advisor in Saudi Arabia. He's effectively like the head of Saudi intelligence. And so it says, therefore, it came at a stage where Bandar took charge of the Saudi intelligence and the Syrian file. The Syrian file is the operation against Assad. Emir Bandar bin Sultan, that the interviewer is asking for clarification, and he says, yes, Bandar bin Sultan. That's that guy right there. He took charge of this file and he began planning how to end the matter. And then the interviewer asks, the matter being Assad, like the Assad-led government. And he says, what matter? And then the guy says, the matter of Bashar al-Assad, on the basis that he will overthrow the Syrian authority within months. They existed for this goal to topple the Syrian government. Bandar bin Sultan asked for a huge budget in the range of $2 trillion. But you mentioned, and then the interviewer asked, but you mentioned that Qatar were in charge of the Syrian file. And he says, no, we were in charge of the Syrian file for the first few months. But after Bandar bin Sultan came, he wanted to take charge of it. A dispute arose between us and Bandar over how to manage the Syrian file. And so that's basically, so the reason I explain all that like, I know that's kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, but I wanted to lay out that context because it's important context for what I'm about to show you and then what we're going to talk about for the next hour. So this guy, Bandar bin Sultan. So just to recap what they were just explaining, that these are former Qatar officials who are no longer in power. And once they're removed from power, they basically go to the press and they say, hey, we're about to get thrown under the bus here. Like, we're about to get blamed for this whole situation because the CIA put us, Qatar, in charge of overthrowing the Syrian government. I just want everyone to know that the Saudis were in on it too. Jordan was in on it. The UAE was in on it. There were a lot of Turkey was in on it. There were a lot of other people who were in on it. We weren't the only ones who did it. So don't pin it all on us. That's what he's saying there. And so what the person he was talking about is this guy, Bandar bin Sultan al-Assad. So he's a member of the royal family. He was the president of General Intelligence from July 2012 to April 2014. And then at that point, but also the Secretary General of the National Security Council from 2005 until January 29th, 2015. And it says the predecessor was office established, meaning in October 2005, this office of the Secretary General of the National Security Council is established. He's put in charge of it, and his successor is office abolished. Now, what happened on January 29th, 2015? Well, King Abdullah, who he served under, dies. And then the crown prince, who at the time was Sultan, MBS's father, becomes king. He immediately appoints his son, MBS, to become defense minister. He's not crown prince yet. He appoints like this CIA shill named Mohammed bin Naif to be the crown prince, which I think he did as like a holding pattern to freeze the CIA and kind of keep them at bay, because they thought, oh, well, our guy is in his crown prince, so we will deal with this King Salman because he's old and he's not going to be around for a while. So we will wait until our crown prince is in the throne, and then we will, take back control of Saudi Arabia. Of course, MBS then immediately goes and abolishes this office. He kicks this guy out. He fires him, and then eventually does the Saudi purge in 2017. And that was when this guy goes on television and kind of says, I just want everyone to know that like we weren't acting alone when we did this. This is all important context because we're going to be talking about Syria and what was actually going on there. And I'm going to turn it over to the Colonel here. But before I do, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context for what the Syrian civil war looks like.
Can I just piggyback on what you just said? Because I want to put Qatar and Qatar in context before you move on. Qatar, or Qatar, depending on how you pronounce it, is the U.S. Central Command headquarters in the Middle East. So as everyone may or may not know, the United States divides the entire world up into combatant commands. Qatar has always been strategically very, very important because the operations that happen in the Middle East all emanate out of Qatar, because that's where U.S. Central Command Forward is located. That is a huge, significant piece because there's a large CIA contingent there. There's a large State Department there as a result, and it also transits tons and tons of funding for NGOs and everything else, because it all gravitates around the central command headquarters there. So that just puts it in context. That is a huge, big deal. Also, the fact that you mentioned the chief of intel basically running these ops just for historical purposes, put that in context with Kamal Adem, who was a predecessor to the chief of intel for Saudi. It was him working with the CIA that ran the whole BCCI money operation, drug networking, weapons trafficking operation out of Pakistan. So that office of Saudi Central Intelligence is huge. Go ahead.
Yes, yes, and thank you for providing that context. And correct me if I'm wrong, but when Bagram got the Air Force base in Afghanistan was shut down by Joe Biden, and everyone's familiar with the disaster of the whole exfil from there. That was the largest military base in the Middle East. Now that that's gone, I believe the largest military base in the Middle East is it Al Ulaid? I can't say the word, but it's a Air Force base in Qatar, I believe, is now the largest military base in the Middle East.
If it's not the largest, it's right up there, because I mean, you've got the training base that's in Saudi that's been there for decades, that just out of Riyadh. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine, a very personal friend of mine, was the commander of that base there for 3 years. It's really, really large. Because it is basically their joint training command where all of their services for interoperability is trained by Air Force trainers. So there are a few, but they are all going to be in the countries that we talk about today.
and then last thing for context, the stories that we've been following, that John's been playing, the videos John's been playing on Devolution Power Hour, that show like Colonel Wilkerson talking to Judge Napolitano, giving the anecdote about a combatant commander, Michael Kurilla, General Michael Kurilla, basically sidelining Jake Sullivan and sidelining Tony Blinken, and saying we're in charge of diplomacy now, and telling them that they're not going to escalate things in the Middle East, but we're actually going to de-escalate things. That person, that general, is the head of CENTCOM, of Central Command, which is the headquarters you just mentioned is in Qatar. So
Correct.
that's all important context, I think, for the story that we're trying to parse here. But just to provide a little context for these different colors that you're seeing on the screen, I believe this map is from, I want to say it's like 2019, maybe 2020. It's from around the end of Trump's term, maybe the beginning of Joe Biden's term. But you see several colors here. So the pink represents the Syrian, the territory that the Assad Syrian government controls right now, or when this map was made. The red dots are all the different battles, and or actually, I think they're all population centers. They're either population centers or population centers. The blue down here is NATO, basically NATO and the United States. The black dots here is ISIS. So these are the territories that ISIS operates in. The yellow are the Kurds. And so we've talked about before on the show when you've come on that Kurdistan is encompasses half of Syria, the northern parts of Iraq, parts of Iran, parts of Turkey. So Kurdistan is up here. So the yellow, and it's divided by this river. So this river basically cuts Syria in half, and everything on the east side of the river, the Kurds control, and everything on the west side of the river, the legitimate Syrian government, the Assad government, controls. The green up here are these are Turkish proxy groups, so groups that the Turkish government have funded or have an alliance with. So they're militias that are operating on behalf of Turkey. And so I'm going to have questions about those groups for you later on. And then the white down here, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, are territories that are controlled by, I want to say, I don't know if it's Hezbollah or if it's, I don't think it's Hezbollah, because I think Hezbollah is in alignment with the Syrian government. I have to go check my notes, but I think the white is a different a militia group that's operating in this region. And there's a lot of this is where a lot of the fighting that you hear about happening in Syria is happening right here in this area, because this is one of the primary conflict zones. So when the war, before I pass it over to the Colonel, when the war in 2012 begins, you have, as Kevork explains in that episode, maybe I'll drop the link to the episode for everyone to listen to. It's like a 1 hour show. It's a great context from a Syrian perspective of what was happening there. As he describes it, it's a total miracle that this $2 trillion budget that's thrown for the sole purpose of overthrowing the Syrian government, the fact that it failed, that the government was able to stay in power, is a total act of God, like miracle. And what happens are two things happen. Number one, Putin sends the Russian military into Damascus, into Syria, and protects Assad. And the other thing that happens is Hezbollah, which is located in Lebanon. So Lebanon is down here. Hezbollah immediately comes into Syria and backs Assad as well. So Hezbollah and Russia together protect Assad, and they basically become the backstop that keeps the CIA from being able to overthrow the Assad government. And earlier I got turned around when I was looking at the map. This white is definitely a separate militia group. So you have one militia group here, the white, like a proxy group, and then the green here is another proxy group, not ISIS. These are like proxy groups that are actually fighting ISIS. And this is where it gets really confusing, because you have all these different groups. And I think the best way to explain it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it would be almost like if a foreign government came into a place like Chicago or New York and went to all the gangs and said, hey, we have billions of dollars we want to give all y'all in guns. Who wants them? And you could imagine that there would be a lot of gangs that would suddenly start forming and organizing in order to get that money and those guns. And that's kind of how I perceive what's happening here, is where they're looking for organized groups that are already operating to either train up or just to give them more arms and support, so that they can then, go out, establish their dominance through kinetic action, recruit to, among the population to bolster their ranks and eventually overthrow the government. And that's kind of the model as I get it for Operation Gladio. But with that said, I will turn it over to you and let you run with it.
So it's a great analogy, but I like the analogy of, because I'm a patterns person, I think the analogy best used in that situation is Afghanistan, because you have the Northern Alliance, you have the Taliban, you have all of these different, obviously you have century-old warlords, basically the same thing in Pakistan. So all of these different factions are going to want to be on the dole. And basically you just outlined the kind of the pincher movement of arming all of these people around Assad in order to be able to overthrow him. And you're right, it's an act of God that he's able to withstand the two. And I don't think people can fully appreciate what you just said. $2 trillion thrown. What does Syria have that's worth $2 trillion on the market?
There you go.
We'll get to that.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously, if you're making a quote unquote investment into overthrowing Assad, the return that you're betting on is something much bigger than $2 trillion. Okay, so think of it in that way as we start talking about this. So just as people who followed me went around the globe understanding that this international syndicate that is made up of oligarchs are after resources and control. So what resources do we have? Because it's going to boil down to resources, right? That's why we throw money at this. So if you go back in time and you look at post-World War II, which is where all of this started, you obviously, I think you're going to find us a map that basically shows us that World War II set up the strategy of tension in the Middle East by creating several countries there that did not exist before. You mentioned basically because you had the Ottoman Empire, we end up with Turkey, modern day Turkey. We end up with modern day Iran out of Persia. We end up with Iraq out of Mesopotamia. We end up with the current configuration of Syria. A brand new country comes about called Israel. Another brand new country comes about called Pakistan. And so you have these interests, we'll just say, operating British interests operating out of Israel and US interests operating out of Pakistan, not exclusively, but kind of in that frame. Well, what happens almost immediately is there's an attack throughout all of Africa and the quote unquote decolonialization only to have them recolonialized by US and UK and NATO, quite frankly, non-governmental organizations that basically just go in and reinstitute colonialism under a different picture, right? So we have to get rid of anybody that wants their country actually free. So in this area that we're talking about, you have a handful of nationalists. You have Nasser in Egypt, he gets taken out. You have Omar Gaddafi, he ends up getting taken out. And you have the Assads in Syria. And those three people all have the same thing in common. They stood against the US, they stood against the UK and imperialism, and they were all for helping their Arab neighbors stand up against the same thing. So they all become targets in general. So did you have something?
Yeah, so real quick, while you gather your thoughts, just to provide context for what you just said, back in 2011, in the spring of 2011, I'm sure everyone has probably heard the term Arab Spring. We've talked about this before on the show, but I'll go ahead and just give a quick summary of what that was. Basically, in the span of a few days, you had these mass uprisings organically form, and I'm doing quotation marks.
Air quotes.
Yeah, air quotes, like organically form in all the countries that you see right here. So all the countries here that have a fist on them, which is basically every single country except for Qatar. Qatar and the UAE are really the only two places where that didn't happen.
And I'll tell you why.
And it looks like Lebanon also, but yes, I definitely want to know why. And ultimately what ends up happening is an operation materializes against Gaddafi in Libya. So Gaddafi is the leader of Libya. And for a long time, he was the guy that, he's characterized as a warlord by the West, by like Western media. But what he's doing is he's basically holding back all of the migrants from Africa who would otherwise be seeking a better life in Europe. And I think it's Al Jazeera in 2011 does a story that says that Gaddafi is giving Viagra to his soldiers and telling them when they're out there fighting ISIS, because ISIS is operating in all these places, or the cells that would ultimately become ISIS are operating in these places. And so these respective militaries are all out there fighting ISIS. And the story comes out from Al Jazeera that he is giving Viagra to his soldiers and telling them to rape women and children while they're as they conquer these villages that ISIS controls. And then NATO uses that as a predicate, as a reason to then go get involved in Africa. NATO had up to that point had never operated in Africa openly. And they say we have to go into Libya to liberate these people from this warlord Gaddafi. And ultimately what happens is that these terrorists surround his castle. Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, he calls her and says, look, I don't want this to end violently. Let's come to a understanding. She says, yeah, the deal is this. You surrender and you can live. And he says, fine, I surrender. And then, of course, she turns him over to the terrorists who then brutally murder him and live stream it on the internet. And then she goes on Western television and literally laughs about it and says, we came, we saw, he died, and then laughs and then cackles and laughs about it. And then that leads to Libya completely imploding and becoming a absolute disaster of a place. The CIA goes in there, raids his bunker, raids his armory, which is the largest private armory in the world, transports all of those weapons from Libya through Cyprus and other places to Syria, and then that's what arms the ISIS cells in Syria to overthrow Assad. And the Benghazi incident, that whole scandal, that's what that was. What that was is that the people who were attacked at that base or that embassy in Benghazi, that's why they were there. The CIA was there trafficking the weapons to
Correct.
Syria, and that's why Hillary Clinton didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to answer questions about it, and they didn't want to send the military in to save them because it would have exposed to the world that they were there trafficking Gaddafi's weapons to Syria.
Correct. So a couple of things. Actually, that isn't the first NATO where they opened. The first NATO operation where they openly worked in Africa was the overthrow of Lumumba in the Congo. They set up the largest NATO base ever set up around the entire area of the Katanga region where the uranium mines and the gold mines and the diamond mines were. That was the first operation in 1960 and 61 under Eisenhower, where he signed the finding to have Lumumba murdered. And that was 100%. The overthrow of the Congo was 100% NATO operations with an actual NATO base functioning out of the Katanga area of the Congo. So yes, but everything else you said is dead on. I want to explain what I have found in Qatar and UAE. Qatar is just like Jordan, UAE, same way. They're under the thumb, in bed with the CIA, the UK, the US, in every single thing they do. The entire $20 billion bank of BCCI was ran out of the UAE with the financial backing of Saudi Arabia. I've already explained the fact that Qatar's in bed with them as well. And so just like in the entire overthrow of Operation Condor of Latin America, do you know the only two entities that were not overthrown were UK colonies, Belize and the UK version of Guyana. Guyana was overthrown, the independent part of it, but not the one under the UK. So everywhere we go and we look at things, if they are a satellite of the UK or the US, they're left alone. Everybody else is overthrown. So that this, again, patterns, it just goes hand in hand. The Edwin, if you guys have never looked up Edwin Wilson, EDWIN, Edwin Wilson, he was basically an arms trafficker for the CIA. And he is the one that began the accumulation of arms in Libya. And he trained them on explosives. He did all kinds of crazy things. He was working on behalf of the CIA. But the CIA wanted to take over his network and get rid of him. He was sent to prison. He was set up by the CIA. Two in particular, whose name's going to escape me. I was just talking about him yesterday. But he was basically put up as a token sacrifice in order to, and they do this all the time. We were just talking about that. They will sacrifice their own in order to close the door, which is what that video of that guy was doing. Basically, you know, he's saying, I just put a couple of quotes down. We didn't know, the wrong people. All of that stuff is bullshit lies. They knew exactly what they were doing because this isn't their first operation. Any of them.
Yes. Yeah. And just to, because there's a lot of people in the chat, like, I think stuck on the money thing, like, where did the $2 trillion come from? Because that's an insane amount of money. And we don't have a specific answer, but I mean, I think the educated speculation is that it comes from like the oil oligarchs. You could imagine how much money like the Saudi royal family has, the Emirati royal family has. They have private oil companies. Aramco only became public under MBS, I think, in 2018. And so before that, they had no public reporting of their money. It was always speculated to be worth trillions of dollars, but we actually didn't know. And then you could imagine that there's also black budget money from like the CIA, the Defense Department, and probably like London and other places as well. So basically, the short answer is oligarchs with vested interest in overthrowing Syria from around the world. They all dumped their money into this and contributed to the $2 trillion pot.
So if you go back and you look at the CIA's overthrow of Allende in Chile, the money came from Freeport Mining, it came from PepsiCo, and it came from ITT, which eventually becomes ATT. They paid Richard Nixon money to basically overthrow the government in Chile. On the black side, the whole reason that we put Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan and set up the world drug trade was to create a black ops kitty to do covert operations. We have been trafficking drugs, we as in this international syndicate, drug networking, weapons networking, and human trafficking all generate cash money. So that's the whole purpose of BCCI, was to launder that cash money into weapon sales and to take the drug profits and cycle them back into weapon sales to create this entire international syndicate, right? So the money comes from the drug trade. Why do you think this war on drug has never actually been won? It's a profit center for the CIA, MI6, Mossad, German BND, and all of those intel agencies, all of which were created post-World War II, in order to fund the $2 trillion. And it's hundreds of billion dollars a year. There has been trillions, tens of trillions of dollars generated in the drug trade alone. And that doesn't even include the weapons. They make money off of trafficking weapons as well. And all of that is done off book by what we refer to as the enterprise, by black elements of the CIA as well, formed after Jimmy Carter got rid of the 1,000 people in the CIA. And they just set up fake companies. Not that they didn't do that before, because they did, but it was largely offshored and off book after that point. And that was the late 1970s. So that money comes from a combination of, as you said, the oil companies and the benefactors of this. And we'll explain to the whole purpose of destabilizing Syria is for the oil companies. There was a pipeline that they want to go through Syria to the port there to supply all of the oil to Europe. The entire destabilization of Syria can be traced back to that. So
yes, exactly.
Go ahead. Did you
keep going? I was going to pull up. I'm going to pull up the pipeline map that you're talking about. I meant to have that handy. The other thing I was going to mention was that what was it? It was Vietnam and Afghanistan. So Vietnam was a lot about the opium there. That was a big and you said BCCI, that bank. That's a bank that almost every single time I talk to Warhamster, he brings that bank up. So that's like a big deal to him, because he's a finance guy and that's his world. BCCI is very, very important to him, and and how it all plays into this stuff. Vietnam, there was a big opium trafficking operation there. I think the number one customer of the drug trade operating out of Vietnam were actually the GIs, the American soldiers that were like in country there. They were the number one customer. So like a lot of the money was coming from the US soldiers paying for drugs to basically indulge in escapism for the horrible situation they were in. And then of course in Afghanistan, similar situation where it was about getting the opium fields and generating the drug trade. So, but I digress. Please continue, and I will.
Both times, because the Taliban actually cleaned up the initial drug trade and transitioned into other crops. It was our reinsertion into Afghanistan that brought the opium back to Afghanistan. A lot of people don't know that. Warhamster and I, on both of our channels, have an entire series of BCCI. We did several shows on it, doing the investigation into how it was all set up. And all of these same players come into play. All of the same countries in the Middle East come into play with this. So, yeah. Syria in post-World War II in the late 40s, I know you've talked about the Sykes-Picot and how Syria ended up under the administration, basically a French colony as a result of that. And so in 1946, when all of the independence movement was going throughout the Middle East and in Africa, France, just as they did in Algeria and many of their other colonies, as did Belgium, fought the independence of Syria being able to be its own country. So we just fought a world war, supposedly under the auspices of freedom. And yet every one of these imperialists that fought on the quote unquote ally side were all still 100% in control of their colonies. And as a matter of fact, that was the whole problem. And what destabilized Vietnam is France would not grant Vietnam their freedom. They went right back in and recolonialized it after they kicked out the Japanese. So you have France culminating a direct attack in Damascus in 1945 and killed hundreds of, if not thousands of people, trying to keep it a French colony. So that, you know, post-World War II is part of the initial destabilization. You have in 1949, the CIA staged a coup in Syria. You had several people that were involved in this coup, but at that point, we had already set up an association with the fascist French elements that had been in bed with the Nazi Germany and created the training of Otto Skorzeny and the OAS agents that were later used in Algeria and in Syria to create this destabilization going on. So there was a guy that, just for name purposes, President Sakri al-Quwati, and I'll spell his last name, Quwatli. So he was just like Mossadegh in Iran around this same time. They were secular. They were not religious fanatics. They just had been elected into a free country, as Iran had gotten rid of the Shah. So Mossadegh was basically in Iran their first moderate president. So this Quwatli guy was the first secular president of Syria post-occupation by France. And so he had a couple problems, though, for the Syndicate. He supported the Palestinian state when, at this exact time, because Israel is only a year old at this time, he was fully aware of the Zionist terrorist units that were sent into Israel to destabilize it in order to create the state of Israel under the auspices of the UK. And he refused to recognize Israel because he still viewed it as a terrorist state. And those were his faults. So as a result of that, he's going to get couped just under, basically similar auspices as Mossadegh. And Mossadegh's in Iran's crime, since they interact today, Iran and Syria, still in the headlines. Iran had tried to work a new oil deal with a new independent country, not under the stewardship of the UK, and he wanted a 50-50 split for profits with the UK oil, BP, eventually. And the UK told him no and tried to coup him. They tried to kill him first. When they couldn't do it, they come and ask the CIA to do it, and Kermit Roosevelt, who we'll see in a minute, in Syria, was actually the CIA agent that went and couped Mossadegh and overthrew the government. They imprisoned him basically in his house for the rest of his life. So these same forces are at play. So Syria's democratically elected president, Quwatli, did not want to approve a trans-Arabian pipeline, which was called TAP Line, which was a joint venture with Standard Oil Rockefellers, who was their attorneys, John Foster Dulles and Alan Dulles, who are now in charge of the State Department in the 1940s, early 50s, for the US, and his brother, Alan Dulles. So they went around the world working oil deals before they joined the State Department and the CIA, doing the exact same kind of mafia-esque criminal syndicate of bludgeoning people into giving up all of their oil resources to Standard Oil or BP or whatever. So they show up in Syria and they try to coerce the Syrian newly independent government into signing a deal, which he did not want to sign because it was going to build a pipeline across Syria. So,
And what year is this?
This is 1949.
Okay. Yep.
So it was going to connect the oil fields of Saudi Arabia with Lebanon via Syria. And so the CIA created a coup and replaced al-Kuwaiti with a handpicked dictator. And he was actually a convicted criminal, by the way. His last name was al-Zaim, Z-A''im. And he immediately dissolves parliament and becomes a dictator, but the people rose up quickly within 14 weeks of the CIA coup and deposed him, overthrew him. So again, you see the beginnings of the destabilization, which allows these outside forces to begin inserting their clutches into, because they call it, that actually has a name called strategy of tension. So the U.S. Department, the U.S. State Department, basically releases a statement in 1949 about the planned CIA coup. Quote, "I want to go on record as saying that this is the stupidest, most irresponsible action a diplomatic mission like ours could get itself involved in, and that we've started a series of things that will never end," unquote. That was from the U.S. State Department saying that what they had just done in destabilizing Syria was going to be a perpetual burning fire, which of course he was right.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because like I've read a lot of like firsthand accounts and firsthand papers from that era, like the 1940s, post World War II, and the entire military brass, as I understand it, this would have been like pre-Pentagon. These are the guys who are the heroes of World War II, the guys who won World War II. They all opposed like the creation of Israel, for example. They said, because you're going to destabilize the region by creating a conflict with the Arabs, who we just were working with to try to liberate the world from the enemy, which was the Axis during World War II. So,
correct.
The very thing that we just tried to defeat, or did defeat, like imperialism, you are now doing imperialism by coming in there and establishing this new state. So but they said that the politicians are going to win this because they have the optics and the media and everything on their side, and they're bought off. And that's what all the military leaders said. And then that, of course, leads into Eisenhower warning about the military industrial complex. But I wanted to share this map real quick because I know that you had mentioned this. This map's from 1952. It shows like the Kirkuk. Anyone who served in Iraq is going to be familiar with that term, with that name, Kirkuk. That's the largest oil field in Iraq.
That's where I was at.
Yeah, you can see how it's run to Syria and Lebanon, as well as down here to Haifa, which at the time was Palestine and then became Israel. And then when Israel was created, the Arabs destroyed the pipeline, and so the pipeline to Haifa was destroyed. But I also wanted to show this other map. And I apologize for the resolution. I should have found a better resolution map. But these are two proposed pipelines, as I understand it. The Islamic pipeline and the Qatar-Turkey pipeline. These were both being proposed around 2010. And these are natural gas pipelines. So these are not traditional oil pipelines. Qatar doesn't have oil. It's actually historically, it's a maritime power. And pearls is actually what it was known for in the ancient world, as massive pearl fields out in the water on its coast. But they discovered a bunch of natural gas there more recently in the past few decades. And so it has massive natural gas reserves underneath it. So they wanted to build a pipeline from Qatar that would run through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, jog through Syria, into Turkey, and then go straight into Europe. And then there was a competing proposal to come out of Iran, to go across Iraq, across Syria, terminate in Lebanon, and then basically they would take the LNG, the liquid natural gas, they would turn it into liquid natural gas, put it on boats, and then ship it across the Mediterranean to wherever it needed to go. And so these were the two pipelines that people wanted to build. Assad was an ally of Putin, and in order to protect Putin, Russia's interests, because Russia was the number one provider for natural gas to Europe at the time. That's why he said no to these pipeline proposals. And because he said no, that was a major driving factor, and he's got to go.
So the transit of liquid gas via ship as opposed to land-based, like even the undersea, like Nord Stream 2, is extremely more costly and not desirable. That's kind of the least of appealing. So back to the timeline, by 1954, the CIA is on their fourth coup of Syria. And they had installed a guy whose last name is Shiskali, Shiskali, and he gets overthrown by the people too. They're just not having it. They don't want, because again, I think what people fail to understand, these countries have been for decades, if not hundreds of years. Like the Congo was a colony of Belgium for 350 years. Yep. So they had been slaves to European imperialism, and they're not having it. They see this. This is like if you were in a jail cell for 300 years and somebody cracks the door, this is their crack. They're not going back. They've got their toe in the door. They've got the entire force of their country pushing on the door for freedom. They're not going back. And people need to understand that. That's what the 40s and 50s were like to these countries. Because they saw they got a little crack, and the Europeans put their entire armies on the outside of that door so that these people could not have their full freedom. They were just going to be able to see it through that little crack. So in 1955, the Syrian people re-elect the guy that the CIA had overthrown, the Kuwatli guy. And so he immediately now knows, because he's now watched Lumumba struggle for freedom in Africa. He's watched many of these entities have to turn to the Soviet Union for weapons in order to push off the CIA, right? So between the late 1940s and the early 1950s, you have this pattern establishing himself that anybody that wants independence, the CIA is going to come in and destabilize along with MI6 and blah, blah, blah. It happened in Iran. It was happening in Egypt. So as soon as he gets back into office in Syria, he picks up the phone and calls the Soviet Union, who is the only entity that will provide weapons that the MI6 and US don't want you to have, because they're going to leverage the World Bank, the IMF, all of these other powers against you. They will starve your people, as they did in South America. It's all out warfare to bring you back under their influence. So he calls the Soviet Union and says, hey, I need help. And so basically, again, that becomes your death wish as well, because that gives the PR department at the CIA the ammunition to begin calling you a communist, right? Not that you're not communist. You have no communist tendencies whatsoever. You're just calling the only other weapons manufacturer in town to shop. So immediately they perceive this as quote unquote non-compliant with the mandated anti-communist rhetoric that is being generated out of the UK and America. And the CIA director at this time is Alan Dulles. He declares, and this is an actual quote, Syria is ripe for a coup, unquote. So he deploys Kermit Roosevelt because Kermit Roosevelt had just successfully overthrown Mossadegh in 1953 in Iran, and a guy by the name of Rocky Stone to Damascus. And he basically says that he wants Kermit Roosevelt to basically orchestrate another coup. So in 1956, you have Operation Straggle, Straggle, which was the CIA's plan to replace al-Kuwatli and basically the entire Syrian government under the quote unquote communist label now. And you have National Security Council member Wilbur Crane Evelyn and Kermit, which we just mentioned, Roosevelt, and a guy by the name of Mikhail Bey Ilyan, Ilyan, who was a former Syrian minister. They all met in Damascus on the 1st of July, 1956, basically to plot his overthrow. And there's a lot more information on this in a book that I have called Killing Hope by William Bloom. He walks you through the entire operation. It's a really good book. I've used it for a lot of our geographical exploration. He goes country by country and exposes Operation Gladio and Condor. Their plan, according to this meeting, was to take control of Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and Hamas, and which were basically the frontier posts with Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon, in order to be able to kind of hem in Syria. And they set up radio stations to pipe in music, and they were basically going to overthrow the government and install a guy by the name of Colonel Kabbani, Kabbani. It ended up getting postponed because the Suez crisis happened, and it becomes very apparent that the plan is not going to work. So on October 31st, John Foster Dulles informs his brother, Alan Dulles, who's the director of the CIA, that with regards to Operation Straggle, our people feel that the conditions are such that it would be a mistake to try to pull it off, because at that time, all of the forces are being marshaled and they against the whole Middle East chaos at that point. And they think because everybody's on high alert, it would lessen the chances of it actually working at that time. So they're not thwarted, though, because right around the corner in 1957, they plan another one. And the CIA commits $3 million to pay off Syrian military officers. And in 57, $3 million is a lot of money. The plan failed when some of the officers went to the Syrian intelligence agency and let them know that they had received CIA bribe money and turned the money over to the government and outed all of the CIA people. So on the 12th of August of 1957, the Syrian army surrounded the US embassy in Damascus and basically told the embassy that they knew of the CIA plot and that they were totally pissed off. So they end up expelling 3 US diplomats, and they jailed a whole bunch of Syrian officers that were in on the plot. And again, I want you guys to notice the dates of this, because people try to pass off President Eisenhower as some, what a great guy he was. And the thing, Gordon, that you mentioned as the warning. Mm-hmm. He was warning us as to what he had actually done. I don't think that was a warning as to try to tell people that you have to guard against it, because he'd already set this up. He's the one that ordered the execution of Lumumba. He's the one that ordered the overthrow of Mossadegh. He's the one that ordered the overthrow of Syria. He was intimately embedded in this operation. So there's nothing that I've come across that indicated he was a good guy.
Interesting.
You can argue that he may have had some regret at the end of his tour, but he signed the finding to execute Lumumba as he's walking out the door. That was done the first part of 1961, just as Kennedy was walking in the door. So
Wow.
he participated in it right up to the end.
Wow. And this kind of aligns with, I think it was 1956, next door in Iraq, they have the
Yes.
the revolution, because the Hashemites, let me just pull the map back up. The Hashemites are who I've talked about before, but they were down in control of Mecca for 700 years, get driven out of Mecca by the British after World War I. They're basically given as like compensation for their efforts in helping to defeat the Axis in World War I. They're given Iraq and Jordan. They wanted Syria, but the British and the French said, absolutely not. You're not getting Syria. We'll give you Iraq with our supervision, and we'll give you Jordan with our supervision. And so then 30 years later, the two cousins, who are like the respective rulers of the two nations, try to form a Hashemite kingdom. That's their plan, is they want to basically form a kingdom between these two countries. And one of the cousins leaves Iraq. The ruler of Jordan leaves Iraq, goes back to Jordan, and right after he leaves, there's a bloody coup where like the prime minister, the ruling family, like the women and the children are all brought out into a courtyard, and they're all shot, and they chop off, they literally butcher the men, and they string them up. They take pictures of it. The pictures are online. And it all kind of, and then the party that did that, the faction that did that, eventually becomes the Ba'ath Party, which is the party that Saddam Hussein comes into power on. But that's a different episode of Breaking History.
Right. But the funders behind the Ba'ath movement was the UK and the US.
Mm-hmm.
So it all fits. They are the instigators, and obviously their standing up of Jordan and Iraq under their control was perfectly fine until they begin plotting. This is the way they would view it, plotting to stand on their own 2 feet and join forces. And as soon as that happens, they both have to go then, right? And Jordan capitulates and becomes basically a vassal state, as did Morocco, of the UK forever. So, if you capitulate to them, you're fine. But that is the only way you're allowed to stand during this period of time, is under their control. You're not going to survive if you are not under their control.
Which explains why the current ruler of Jordan, King Abdullah, is perceived by Arabs to be like a traitor. Basically, it's like they all think of him as a traitor, because they're like, well, like you're basically going along with what Israel and what all these Western interests want to do. Why? And the answer is because if he doesn't, they literally will butcher his children. They will literally butcher his wife. They'll do it in the most grotesque way imaginable, just like they did to Gaddafi. And so for a lot of people, just from a personal incentive standpoint, they're gonna capitulate because they don't want their children to be cut up into pieces.
They boiled Mossadegh in oil or in acid.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Yeah.
We're dealing with really, really, really violent people. The people in DC, very violent people,
and in London.
Let's do the second ad. And then we'll begin to wind down. We'll probably got another 10 minutes or so, 10 to 15 minutes. And then of course, just given our trajectory, you're going to need to come back probably next week if you're available.
Absolutely.
And then Matt will be back, and Matt's going to have his own contributions as well. So
absolutely.
Let's do the second ad.
It's widely known that the body's own immune system is a God-given first responder to help us deal with the smallest of concerns to the most catastrophic. Our friends at Pet Club 24/7 have developed natural products that contain the most potent strain of mushroom that's been used for thousands of years to support the immune system. So visit the website today to discover how they're changing the way that pets and people are being treated for the better.
All right. Well, thank you, Pets Club. Yes.
So this is the part that gets up to where I know you have spent a lot of time. So in 2003, there are documents that are discovered by the British, he releases them. The British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, releases a treasure trove of documents, which in the document says that the US President Dwight Eisenhower conspired to plunder Syria's oil resources and to assassinate 3 Syrian people to force regime change. Those 3 people that were named in the document was a guy by the last name of Sarraj, the chief of military intelligence, whose last name is Al-Izra, and the Khalid Bakdash, Bakdash, who was the leader of what the West had labeled a communist party inside of Syria. And that the UK had used the Muslim Brotherhood, which is their own bought and paid for trained terrorist organization, and financed it and weaponized it to topple the Syrian government and assassinate these people. They were going to use and that transitions, of course, to what you led off with, the use of ISIS, which is a CIA, MIK, or MI6 funded, created Western terrorist organization. And that's what's being used today. But they did this back in the 1950s as well. And these declassified documents bear that out. They used a supposedly organically developed, and I use those in air quotes, terrorist organization called the Muslim Brotherhood. Then also from like the 1960s to 71, there has been every single president. If you go just look at the number of presidents Syria's had during this time, it's like they elected one, it was overthrown. He elected one, they were overthrown. So again, this goes on for quite a while. And then we get up to 1967, where you have the Israel contingent illegally occupying the Golan Heights. The 6-Day War happens. And basically, we blow that whole thing apart with everything that we were told about that war is a lie. That was never anybody fearing Egypt attacking Israel. Egypt had 75,000 of their people in Yemen at the time, dealing with a crisis that the British authorities had created in Aden. So there was no way that Egypt had the forces on tap to be able to attack anybody at that time. They were already in a conflict with helping Yemen out. And so this was 100% staged by the West with Israel to try to overthrow Nasser, because again, we've already established the fact he's one of the targeted guys as well for regime change. And in 1986, there's a declassified CIA document that outlined the potential for military insurgent if Assad were to suffer a major defeat by Israel and try to liberate the Golan Heights. And a lot of people believe that that was the other shoe that was supposed to drop if the U.S. could sink the USS Liberty and justify their entrance into the war, is that we were going into Syria.
Yes, and just to provide some illustration to what the colonel was describing, this is a map. This is a 6-day period. So over a 6-day period in 1967, this is when Israel militarily occupies Palestine. So you have the West Bank, this large territory here, and then you have Gaza down here. And at the time, Gaza is basically a protectorate of Egypt, so it's considered kind of part of Egypt almost. The blue is Israel before the war begins, and then the lightest green, which is up here, Syria, the Golan Heights, is what they occupy by the end. So everything that's colored here is what they occupy by the end of the war, and they do it with the backing of French and British troops. And so at the end of the 6 days, they actually militarily occupied the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt.
Yeah. And I mean, that was huge. And they were trying to provoke, with the sinking of the USS Liberty, kind of like we've done in the past, a false flag in order to justify the US's entrance into that Luckily for the survivors of the USS Liberty, that did not come to pass, or I think all of this would have ended at that point with a complete takeover of the Middle East.
Yes, yes. And so if what she is describing right now sounds familiar, if it rhymes with what you're hearing about in the news today, it's because it does.
Exactly.
Attacks happening in the Middle East, trying to justify, with encouragement and warmongering coming out of DC, saying we got to go protect our interests. U.S. soldiers are dying, and then the question is, well, why are they there? Why are they over there in the first place? Like that is all the rhyme and reason of why how they justify these wars, because the USS Liberty survivors will tell you that they were sunbathing on the deck of the ship, and then these Israeli warplanes fly over. They're sitting there waving at them, and then the planes dive and start firing machine guns at them. And they're
dropping
like,
napalm on them.
And they're dropping napalm on the ship, and they're like 30 or 40 guys out on the deck, just like sunbathing, like relaxing, and they're all like, what's going on here? So that's the deep state trying to get us into a war. And
that's probably a good place if you want to transition. We can kind of pick up from there because
yes.
your analogy is perfect, because false flags to generate, and we see them happening all the time, especially in this region. The biowarfare that that Syria was accused of using, when in fact they didn't use any of it, and the entire investigation was compromised. That was another false flag to generate more, outrage and attack of Syria in order to weaken the government. This has been an ongoing thing since the late 1940s to destabilize Syria.
Yes, yes, so what we'll talk about next week, as the Colonel and I kind of discussed a little bit before we went live. Assad was a doctor. He was an eye doctor, optician, I think is what they're called. And basically his father was the president. His father was a politician. His brother was a politician. His brother was supposed to be the heir apparent. His brother is killed. And then he's kind of forced into like this unwilling participant to kind of become the leader. And he has to abandon his medical career and kind of go into politics, and becomes like the guy. And that's his storyline. And it's a pretty interesting backstory. We'll get into that more next week with Matt here present to add his takes on some of this stuff. But you can kind of understand when you hear all of this, when you hear the Colonel describing how these operations are run, why it would be so important if you wanted to defeat that monster, this intelligence apparatus that operates internationally, why you would need an alliance of like-minded individuals who aren't necessarily after the exact same end game. They just want their own sovereignty. They want to be liberated from the monster. And so that's why you would want to see guys like MBS, Xi, Putin, all on the same page with a leader like Donald Trump, working in concert, working together. Because if you don't have those guys on your team, it's very easy for the monster to manipulate events and turn the individual sovereign actors against one another, thinking that they're attacking the enemy when really they're attacking somebody who's like-minded and wants sovereignty just like them. Correct.
I could not have said that better.
Awesome. Well, let's see if we have any Badlands boosts real quick, and then we will wrap up. If you want to, can you tell people where to find you?
Yes.
Best coordinates?
Yeah. On X, I'm at the @Colonel Towner. On True Social, I'm at Colonel Watkins. I have a Rumble channel called The Colonel's Corner. We do book reviews, and on X, Monday through Friday, obviously not we'll do one today, but not for the rest of the week. At 4:00, we do a show specifically about Operation Gladio and this international syndicate that we talk about. And we have on my pinned profile a link to like a box that has all of the previous shows that we basically we did basically a military operation, if you will, that went COCOM by COCOM of all of the coups that the CIA, and we didn't cover all of them. We did enough in every geographical area because there's over 100 of them. And we did enough in a geographical location to establish patterns of what was going on. And so that's all on the pinned post on my X profile.
Wow. Well, that sounds pretty cool. We'll have to definitely check that out. All right. So we have a few boosts. And if you want to support us, you can go to badlandsmedia.tv /boost. And it's just like a Rumble rant that you can do anytime if you're listening to this on replay. And we have a very generous one here from our friend Crane59. Crane, man, I really appreciate this. $100. It says, Gordon and Matt, this has been a long time coming. Your show teaches me something new every time I watch. After 65 years, a old adage by Grandpa comes to mind. If you don't learn something new every day, that was a wasted day. Kudos, my friends. Love your show. Crane, really appreciate it, man. Always love seeing you, Gart. I will make sure Matt reads that message as well. I'll revisit that next week. And then we had a second one from Sylvia. Sylvian CA. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I apologize, but it's $25. Dear Matt and Gordon, love your show. Your knowledge of history is impressive. Also, you make history and current events relevant and interesting. I'm a Christian Palestinian. Please do a study on Christian Zionism, how it affects U.S. policy. Wow, that's pretty awesome to get feedback from a Christian Palestinian. So, yes, I am very aware that you exist, that Christian Palestinians are real, and Brian and I have talked about that on Badlands Daily. I have actually been working on some research about Christian Zionism. I've been doing that for a while and seeding it into my writing a little bit and trying to understand it better. And that's probably something that I would want to talk to you about, because it definitely seems to tie into the CIA. John Siglob is a name that comes up. The Western Goals Foundation. The Western Goals Foundation is a name that comes up. So
I just talked about them yesterday.
Okay, well, I need to know more about them, because my rabbit trails have all kind of run out on them, and I need to confirm a few things that I suspect, and also kind of tie up some loose ends that I can't find the answers to. So you and I will talk about that offline.
Anti-Communist League.
Yes, there you go. Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Colonel, for being here. I'm glad that we can make this work. Look forward to next week. We will do part 2 on Syria. So everyone tune in with Matt present. And everybody have a happy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to you, Colonel. Thankful for everyone listening.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone. And I would just say on my Substack, it's called The Colonel's Corner as well. I did a background paper on Zionism only for my own purpose, because I didn't even know what it was. And it remarkably goes right back to the Fabian Society where Operation Gladio started. So yeah, that's a very interesting rabbit hole.
It's crazy how everything is circular. It's like everything always comes back to the same thing, and it's wild. Yes. That's what will cultivate an interest in history, if nothing else will, is that these stories all tie together. Correct. And they don't exist at all independently of one another. None of them exist in a vacuum. The same characters show up. It's a really interesting dynamic. So
I agree.
Well, with that said, thank you all, everybody. This has been a great episode, and we will see you next week. And I'm going to play the Badlands intro, because everyone always says I never play an outro. So I'll play the Badlands intro, and then we'll get out of here. Bye, everybody.
Badlands, run into Badlands, explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.